The deployment of the AFP and the ABC in support of the government's policy to prioritize its international relationship with Indonesia ahead of the welfare of Schapelle Corby could not be more clear. However, government policy is equally applied across all relevant departments and areas. This includes those less visible to the public. Despite having a lower profile, examples of this do sometimes manifest in the public arena. One example of this was the seizure of Schapelle Corby's book royalties. These were intended to meet her enormous legal costs, enable a legal challenge, and pay for her mother to continue to travel from Australia to visit her. Yet, incredibly, Schapelle Corby was deprived of these vital funds.
Now this girl writes her book, telling about her injustice case, while clinging to innocence, full of hope and faith. But our government's turned a deaf ear, saying, oh, it's just a proceed of crime. Well, I say, what kind of injustice do we got going on here? Do they think that we're blind and we cannot see the dirt on their hands? Do they think they got the rights to play with strings like puppeteers?
For the first time in Australian history, legal action was taken to seize book royalties under, quote, proceeds of crime, unquote, legislation. In 2005, Schapelle Corby begged the Australian government to forensically test the marijuana for country of origin, which could have freed her. Despite having treaty provision to do so, they refused to act.
But Howard was a lawyer, like John Howard's a lawyer. He knew what was going on, and yet time and time again they kept on saying that they had no influence with the Indonesian courts. And yet there was a policy which was signed in 1987, which is a treaty allowing them that they must get a sample of evidence in murder or drug cases. If they apply for it, then it must be given. And the Australian government kept on telling the Australian people that they couldn't interfere. Well, they weren't interfering. They had every right to. The AFP could have asked for a sample, and they had every right to ask for that sample of marijuana.
Police turned it into a public bonfire, burning the items Corby was carrying when she was arrested in 2004. They included her boogie board bag and the 4.2 kilograms of marijuana customs officials found inside it.
We don't have a chance anymore to bring this evidence to the court when there is extraordinary.
The evidence was destroyed on the orders of the Supreme Court.
Schapelle Corby begged everyone she could to forensically test the evidence. But the government later represented this reality entirely differently.
And more.
The Freedom of Information Act is intended to allow citizens to have access to information in possession of their elected government. In 2009, a test request was made for information relating to the AFP's dealings with the Indonesian National Police with respect to Schapelle Corby. Having exhausted all means of delay, the AFP-FOI team eventually provided blank page after blank page and admitted blatant censorship. However, the rationale provided for this censorship was revealing in itself. The other government departments abuse the legislation in a similar manner. The Departments of Foreign Affairs and Trade, the Australian Communications and Media Authority, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, the Australian Customs Service, the Director of Public Prosecutions, the Department of Transport. For the Australian government, Schapelle Corby's 2006 appeal presented another political hurdle. It is now clear that the Australian government's fall guys for this situation were always intended to be the soft target of her Indonesian lawyers. This avoided confrontation with Indonesia, exposure of systemic AFP corruption, and any blame for themselves. The Corby family were pressed into accepting what was presented as help: the services of an Australian QC named Mark Torwell. What transpired was shocking. Mark Torwell QC caused huge damage to Schapelle Corby's chances. He told the media that a member of Schapelle Corby's legal team had sought government money to pay bribes. This acute antagonism of the Indonesian legal system had predictable results for Schapelle Corby in the Indonesian court.
We've had, at her appeal, it is alleged that an Australian government-appointed Queen's Counsel made public statements that were not beneficial to Schapelle's case, in fact were blatantly detrimental to her case.
Mark Torwell is a past member of the West Australian Liberal Party and long-term friend of Chris Ellison, the Justice Minister. Torwell was later reprimanded by the State Administrative Tribunal for this appalling act, which, even had it been true, was a clear breach of client confidentiality. This mere reprimand by the establishment for such disturbing and serious misconduct was roundly condemned by many observers. For Schapelle Corby, once again, the consequences of someone else's actions were devastating. The government had again avoided scrutiny of AFP and airport corruption and destabilisation of its relationship with Indonesia.
Between 2001 and 2005, there were 360 white powder hoaxes in Australia. On average, That is one envelope containing harmless powder every few days. This commonplace type of incident attracted no or little comment from the government and little media interest. In June 2005, one such envelope arrived at the Indonesian embassy. The note in the envelope contained no reference at all to Schapelle Corby. It was even written in Bahasa and not English. The powder was basically flour. The government's reaction was staggering as they seized upon it instantly. Foreign Minister Alexander Downer referred to it during the afternoon as, quote, a biological agent, unquote, with Prime Minister Howard blaming, quote, murderous criminality, unquote, on Schapelle Corby supporters. At 6:35 p.m., an email from the National Manager of Intelligence with the Australian Federal Police advised the Minister for Justice that, quote, Gram bacilli is a commonly occurring bacteria, unquote, stating that there was no hard evidence that it was dangerous. Instead of immediately correcting their highly damaging statements, the government allowed the original stories to roll, with headlines across the world attributing blame to Schapelle Corby's supporters for a biological attack. Protests for Schapelle Corby were abruptly halted as the public were alarmed at association with terrorism. The government had successfully undermined the emerging support movement. To this day, they have refused to say where the term, quote, biological agent, unquote, came from. They refused to explain why they didn't refer to the non-English note and non-reference to Schapelle Corby. They refused to explain why they didn't reference the hundreds of other harmless powder incidents. They have never explained why they allowed the false story to roll around the world when they could easily have corrected it at the outset.
In advance of the appeal, the government received new and important evidence about Schapelle Corby's bags. They were informed that there was no record of the boogie board bag on the Sydney International Airport system. The other bags were all recorded normally. There was no screening or other record for this one bag. No record of it at all. But Schapelle Corby's lawyers had only been told there was no data. They were unaware that this only applied to the boogie board bag, that there was now cast iron evidence that the boogie board bag was treated differently behind the scenes. The government realised that this evidence was important. They realised the implications. The Minister also asked AFP Commissioner Keelty what amounted to, "Who else have you told about this?" Neither Schapelle Corby or her lawyers were ever made aware of this evidence. It was never submitted to a court. It remained hidden until revealed to Hidden World Films in October 2010.
With so many government departments deployed, and on an issue as politically charged as this one, it is unlikely that ASIO, the Australian Security Intelligence Organization, would not also be used. Indeed, allegations are rife that this shady government body was directly or indirectly involved in threats to the Indonesian embassy in 2005, which were presented to discredit Schapelle Corby's supporters. Others suggest that even to this day, they actively monitor and take steps to fragment supporter groups.
We monitor our access logs very carefully. Every day they take copies of the Women for Schapelle blog. Every day they hack it with SiteRipper software.
Because of the political potential of the case, we have been designated as subversive and intensely managed. This has included electronic monitoring, group infiltration, internal group influence, and undermining of those supporter projects deemed to be of significant risk. Recently, we have seen pro-government counter-influence directed specifically at group members. The pattern of events is so clear that there is absolutely no doubt this has taken place, and it still does. Yet many people are completely oblivious to it. Schapelle Corby supporter groups have been managed as intensively as terrorist cells.
Despite the underground nature of their activities, there is an increasing body of evidence to suggest their long-term involvement in this case.
They were the ones who kept fires burning, never acknowledging then that they were hurting. They're all blinded by dollar notes, tenders in their eyes.
On behalf of the Corby family, I have many times made complaints to the Commonwealth Ombudsman regarding various government agencies. Throughout, the Ombudsman's Department have dodged, delayed, evaded. They have failed to take any of the complaints seriously. They have proved themselves to be nothing more than a rubber stamp. It seems the Australian government and their departments are unaccountable for their actions and for what they've done to Schapelle Corby.
And I hope that one day they look into the mirror and they are haunted by all the people left to rot in shackles and chains. Yeah, some call them watchdogs. Ha! I call them useless, toothless, dogs of shame. Yes, they're all fork tongues, they're all useless, toothless, dogs of shame.
Then there is the never-ending list of statements from senior politicians and ministers, ranging from unhelpful to extremely hostile and damaging. Here are just a handful of them.
20 years in jail for crimes no one will admit. She says she can't admit to crimes that she did not commit. She begged the judge for clemency, put her life into his heart, but her life was in his hands instead. While she pled Sayatidak, Barcelona, be brave, Schapelle, be brave, and try to stay so strong. For the trial by media you suffer is also very wrong. Keep fighting in that prison and keep your spirits high. We know that there will come a day when back home you will fly.
In September 2011, Files documenting dozens of breaches of Schapelle Corby's human rights were submitted to the Australian government and to over 100 MPs and senators. These included breaches at the Bali trial and current abuses in prison, such as forced display to the media for prison PR and for public curiosity, which would also flout the Geneva Convention in a war scenario. Not a single response was forthcoming.
So you're saying, in effect, it's their job to do the bidding of the government?
Their job is to work within the framework of policy, subject, of course, to not breaking the law.
So is it their job to do the bidding of government as long as it's legal?
In my view, it is. In my view, it is. In my view, it is.
There can be no doubt that in 2005, the Australian government took the political decision to protect a political relationship at the terrible expense of Schapelle Corby. As with all government policies, all the organs of state were deployed to support it and were lined up directly against her. The effects on her have been devastating. Even though we have presented only a partial list, the scale of government activity against Schapelle Corby is staggering. It is also important to understand that when a government sets the tone and agenda for an issue, the establishment and large commercial interests within that nation invariably adopt a supportive position. Schapelle Corby and her family have not only had to endure a terrible ordeal in Indonesia, but the vilification and hostility of a second state. This shocking truth is finally starting to emerge. But with Schapelle Corby now suffering serious health issues, it may well come too late to save her life.
Well, if you're the kind that feels unsure, why not sit alone and let the dingo call? Your memories of a wrongful conviction from years before. Injustice takes away destination paradise. There's an Aussie girl doing time. A part of the crime. Injustice takes away destination paradise.
The moment people stop standing up to injustice, then it's all over. We might as well just, crawl back into the slime from whence we emerged.